Hi everyone, welcome back to Rocks for Jocks. Over the last few weeks, the Los Angeles area has been slammed with an incredibly destructive wildfire, giving a lot of extreme visuals for news crews to broadcast 24 hours a day. This, in turn, led to a lot of people fiercely debating the causes and effects of fire damage, both online and in person. As a climate and natural hazards podcast host, I felt a really strong need to address these fires in some way. I don't think I've learned enough about wildfires yet to lecture publicly without running the risks of making mistakes and adding to the public online confusion. Instead, I decided the best way to do this would be to host an expert and ask them about what's going on. As a result, I have today's episode with Dr. Peter Sousounis, who has spent his career studying, teaching, and modeling climate events and natural hazards. I wanted to learn more about things like how we got such a destructive wildfire in wintertime, what's needed to stop this specific fire, how to protect buildings in the future, and more. For some background on Dr. Peter Sousounis and our connection, Peter and I overlapped for a few years working at a large catastrophe modeler. This is software for estimating losses from natural hazards, such as earthquakes, wildfires, and hurricanes. This software is then used by insurance companies or reinsurance companies or government agencies to estimate losses from ongoing or future catastrophes, which in the long run helps everyone better prepare for disasters. Peter now works as an independent consultant, still in the field of climate and natural hazards, and he recently released an article about the ongoing LA wildfires with the Society of Actuaries Catastrophe and Climate Steering Committee. I thought the article was really interesting and thought this was a great opportunity to have Peter talk about the wildfires and hear a little bit more about what he's up to and his opinions of recent catastrophe modeling. For a quick disclaimer, these opinions are our own and not representative of any companies or organizations. If you like this episode, please subscribe wherever you're listening and share with family and friends. I am personally planning out and recording and editing and promoting all of these shows for free, which I love doing for the sake of sharing information with others. But of course, more people listening gets me encouraged to pump out more content. So if you want to hear more quality episodes like this, please subscribe and share with new people. Now kick back and enjoy the show. Thank you so much, Peter, again for joining me today. I was wondering if you could maybe give me a little bit of an introduction about yourself and kind of maybe what you've been working on recently, as much as you're comfortable sharing publicly.
Sure. I'm Peter Sousounis. By education, I'm an atmospheric scientist, and I think I actually started my career as a professor at the University of Michigan. And besides doing the usual professorial things, I really had my eyes opened into the world of climate change. It was way back when. I won't necessarily give you a year, but I got involved in the first U.S. climate change impacts assessment. That's relevant because I cut my teeth on how to talk about complicated subject matter to general lay people. Farmers, for example, business owners, bank water resource managers, etc., all wanted to know about climate change. Fast forward a little bit, the second half of my career, I went to private industry and I discovered catastrophe modeling. I still had the opportunity to talk about extreme weather events and climate change, but I also got exposed to the insurance industry as one example and learned what some of their unique needs and interests were. And now, having kind of left both of those areas, although I still keep in touch with both of them, I am a private consultant, a climate change expert, if you will, helping other companies and even individuals better manage their risks to extreme weather events and climate change.
The catastrophe modeling is where my background lies and maybe what I'll subconsciously focus on the most a little bit here. I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what are some of your biggest areas of catastrophe modeling that you think are still being worked on, and maybe why improving catastrophe modeling in the first place is so important to so many people.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. So I will say there's been a lot of work since the development of the catastrophe modeling industry back in the late 80s, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think some of the latest foci, if you will, have been on developing more globally comprehensive, globally correlated models. So a lot of the model vendors develop catastrophe models for the individual perils, hurricanes, European winter or windstorms, wildfires in Australia, for example. They're not necessarily correlated from year to year. Year one for the Australia wildfire model isn't necessarily correlated to year one of the US or the Atlantic hurricane model. And especially from a reinsurance standpoint, that's very important to do. Reinsurers, for one, want to know what their global annual risk is going to be, both from a mean standpoint as well as from like what some of the return period losses could be. So that's definitely one area. And then including all of those perils from a global standpoint, providing what I call a more holistic view is also important. Asset managers, investors definitely want to have that information. So I think those are two areas, just broadening and developing this correlated capability across the perils and literally across the planet is what I think has to be done.
Thank you so much. Without going and digging into any individual companies, I don't want to upset anyone too much. Do you have a sense of maybe which models are doing well across the board, which could maybe use the most improvement? Which have investors been looking at more recently?
Yeah, I think I can answer that question by keeping all the model vendors anonymous. Uh, and I think I can say, I mean, again, there are kind of multiple areas, but wildfire is a big one. It used to be referred to as the secondary perils. These are the perils that were not given the greatest scrutiny or the greatest concern because they weren't generating as many losses as, say, hurricane losses or flood losses. But now they're getting up there. Severe weather, severe convective weather is one of those models, especially from a hail standpoint. I won't necessarily go into a lot of those details, but wildfire is another one. And both of these are really capturing attention, especially because of the very recent, very extreme events that have been associated with those two perils. But also, and related to that, is because they're happening more and more, it seems, out of season. Remember those long track tornadoes that went through Kentucky several years ago in December? Severe weather can happen at any time of year, not necessarily at that intensity and not necessarily in wintertime. And another example is the one that has brought us together today, which is the wildfires in LA. Now, wildfires can happen again at any time of year in the Western US, and they do. And in the blog that was posted, you can see that they do happen, although with a lot less frequency than they do at other times of year. But it's definitely capturing people's attention. And one of the things I think is important to note is because they have happened in winter, they can be very intense.
I think that that's an awesome introduction. Thank you so much. I'll start with saying, even though I worked in catastrophe modeling for a little bit, a lot of my focus was on earthquake science, data science, liquefaction, landslides, that kind of thing. So I honestly don't know too much about wildfires here. I don't want to pretend to be an expert, especially in front of an expert. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about why wildfires might be happening in the wintertime and why that might cause them to be more intense, if that has maybe something to do with wind patterns that emerge in the wintertime in Western US? Anything you want to share would be great.
Thanks for that question, Alex, and the prompt. It's been a great learning experience for me, too. I did start out my career certainly as a wildfire expert. When I was at the University of Michigan, it was more canonical areas, lake effect snowstorms, even hurricanes. But wildfires is something I picked up on in about the last 5 years. And I've learned quite a bit, and I continue to learn a lot. And I think my background in meteorology and climate science has really come in handy in trying to understand the severity of not just the event that we're talking about, but what similar events might unfortunately show. So let's talk about what's different between the winter and the summer. First of all, the common thread here is we're in a developing La Nina situation. And with any La Nina situation, that is going to build a pressure ridge, a high pressure area over the Western US and lower pressure over the Eastern US. This is what we're all experiencing. We've been experiencing it for kind of the last few weeks, and it's expected to grow and continue. And this particular pattern will unfortunately stay with us definitely through the end of the month. Now, what is special about the wintertime is that the air is a lot colder in the polar regions. That enhances the pole to equator temperature difference. That enhances the pressure gradient, and the weather systems are just a lot stronger. So the high pressure system is able to funnel that cold, dry air farther south. It's obviously not that cold when it gets to the Rocky Mountains in the US, and certainly not when it gets to California, but it maintains that dryness. Now, California has been dry for several months. They really haven't had a good rain since probably going back to May. When you take that cold, dry air from the high pressure in Canada and funnel it through the Santa Ana Mountains, a couple of things happen. First of all, I noted that the air is already dry. And keep in mind that in wintertime, it's just dry. The air is always a lot drier. I don't know about you, but I get dehydrated more in winter than I do in summer. So that's just kind of putting it in perspective. You take that already dry air, you funnel it through the mountains, and you push it downhill. When you push it downhill, it warms even more. It's something called an adiabatic compression. And when it warms, the relative humidity really gets a lot lower. So it's even drier than when it started. And that just further enhances the wildfire readiness of any fuel that is in the way of that air. So those two factors, that you have strong, cold, dry, high pressure, forcing a very strong, dry winds through the Santa Ana Mountains in the wintertime, that doesn't necessarily happen to the same extent in the summertime. That's the unique factor.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. For the audience, I'm reading from a blog that Peter and a few others put together and released on January 11th. One sentence specifically in here popped out to me. I think it was, quote, "The severity of the weather pattern giving rise to the Los Angeles wildfires is analogous to a Category 5 hurricane," unquote.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate just a little bit more on kind of what that means, and I guess how you're thinking about the comparison between hurricanes and wildfires in this context?
Right. So I will say that it's kind of a figurative comment. And first of all, thanks for mentioning the blog. It was a team effort. I'm a member of the Society of Actuaries Cat and Climate Steering Committee. And we all got together literally late last week and thought that we should write something. And I volunteered to spearhead the effort, but it was a team effort. Now, the Category 5 reference is kind of figurative. It's not necessarily literal. I don't mean that the winds going through the Santa Ana Mountains are 155 plus miles per hour like a Category 5 hurricane. But the winds are incredibly strong, and wind gusts have exceeded 100 miles per hour. And it's hard to say really how fast some of the gusts have been. They are definitely hurricane strength for sure. But when you look at the destruction in certain, they go on blocks and blocks. I was just looking at some of the videos this morning in Malibu, coastal Malibu. It looks worse than a Category 5. It looks almost like an EF5 tornado went through the area. The damage pattern is a little different because the houses are all burned, but there's nothing left of them for blocks and blocks and blocks. And this is what a Category 5 hurricane does. This is what an EF5 tornado does. It just literally levels anything in its path. That was the reference. And when I saw the destruction, I said, this is like a Category 5.
Got it. Okay. So your reference, if I'm understanding correctly, is more about the level of complete damage, complete destruction.
Right. Although the winds, in terms of maybe the probability of the winds reaching those levels, it remains to be seen if there can be more accurate measurements of some of what the top wind speeds have been. Anemometers have trouble maintaining their integrity with speeds like that, and they even do fail when hurricane winds of that speed, 130 mile per hour winds, can destroy some anemometers. So it'll be interesting to see what some of the measurements actually are for this event.
Got it. And you mentioned the term a couple of times, anemometer. Is that a way of measuring wind speeds?
Sorry, I'm using lingo, but an anemometer is simply a device for measuring wind speed.
Thank you. Was there anything else that you thought was especially important to highlight from that blog that you wanted to talk about here?
I think an important aspect is, aside from the property damage, and people will rebuild, one is the human health standpoint. We could talk a little bit about that. Another aspect is then just what is this going to do to the insurability of the region? California is just already stressed. Some insurers have already pulled out of the market. This is certainly not helping their cause. So something is going to have to be done about what the event is literally going to do to the affordability and, more importantly, the availability of insurance in California for these kinds of events. I think it's hard to say ultimately what is going to happen, but I think a more important consideration is what can residents do to help their cause. I think one important aspect is improving the resilience across the region to these kinds of events. And there are some basic measures that can be done, right? So new houses, it's likely that the new houses will be built with more fireproofing, tempered glass, etc., different materials. But there are simple things that residents can already do in areas where they have been fortunate enough to not have been affected yet that they can do. So building fireproof perimeters around their house, making sure that the area inside of the perimeter is clear of any material that can catch fire. Just some basic, almost common sense things to do. Yes, they can retrofit their homes with more tempered glass, keeping wood away, wrapping their steps in metal sheathing, I should say. These are relatively inexpensive measures that can be done. And in some cases, insurers are actually giving credit for those sorts of efforts and activities. So that will help both the residents, the homes, as well as the insurability of the region.
Yeah, that was another big question I had when you're preparing for the next natural disasters. What are some of the easy wins that either individuals or larger groups can do? So I know there's ideas being floated around, like rebuilding all the housing with the most fireproof material possible. And yeah, just kind of curious how much of that is possible for people.
Right. So making the building envelope, if you will, and that is more lingo, but the envelope simply is a reference to the outer covering, the sides of the house, the roof of the house, anything that sticks out, etc. Uh, Fireproof. Ember proof is more important because the most common way that a fire will spread to another building is through flying embers, right? They land on the roof, they sit there, they smolder, and eventually the roof material can catch fire, especially if it has some kind of a petroleum product that is used as a base for building the roof. So making the roof fireproof, making the side of the house fireproof, and anything that's touching the house fireproof, including, like I said earlier, removing the brush and debris. And please don't put wood chips in your front lawn because those are basically just like matches in the front yard. So keeping it clear, a stone garden will look just as nice, I think, and it'll certainly be a lot more fireproof.
Great. And then I guess kind of going back to the catastrophe models for another couple of minutes here. I know smoke damage models are notoriously challenging to build and keep up with. I had a coworker that had worked at one of the other big catastrophe modelers, and he had the story of being asked, "Hey, one of our clients wants a smoke model. How quickly can you build that?" And he had to put it together in a couple of weeks, kind of thing. And he'd never worked on smoke modeling before. Just kind of threw together some formulas from different equations he had looked at and called it a day. I know there's just a lot of factors that get involved there when you start to think about wildfire intensity and what materials are on the ground and which directions the wind going, how quickly the wind's moving, and how quickly that wind itself is changing. So a lot that goes into smoke models. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of how much they've improved over the years or how much improvement might still be possible for them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. And I have to say that since I initially mentioned the wildfire peril as a secondary peril, we consider smoke as a secondary sub-peril of the wildfire models. And from that standpoint, incorporating the capability for the smoke to do damage and quantifying the damage from that smoke, I think that is just about still in its infancy. I know there's some vendors that have been incorporating first generation smoke models to account for how much fuel has burned, the distance from the source that's generating the smoke to the object or the asset in question, and then the wind speed, which is important in the different directions. But there's so much more that has to be considered. As a meteorologist, I could really go to town on this question and consider, well, what is the atmospheric stability like? What are the orographic features? Sorry, more lingo. The terrain features. Are there hills? Are there embankments, etc.? That's deflecting the smoke. What is the composition of the smoke? That is very important as well, because we have different types of material that's being burned, right? So they generate different types of chemicals, carcinogen. They're all carcinogenic,
Mhm.
but some are worse than others. So it's important to understand what the materials are that are being burned, but that can also affect the density of the smoke plume itself and how it moves with the wind, which means how much or what else it's going to affect in its path. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, does actually, people can go on the web and see smoke model forecasts from a different perspective. Obviously, there's a health concern as well. So, knowing where that smoke is forecasted to go is also very important, especially for people that have respiratory illnesses, etc. And all that information is freely available.
Do you also see any kind of smoke damage research, anything like that taking place at universities? Do you have a sense of what types of research is being funded in that area?
I know there are. I'm not the expert when it comes to smoke. I'm still learning about it. But I know because NOAA was advertising that they have just updated their high resolution smoke model. It actually has a resolution on the order of a couple, 2 or 3 kilometers. So you can go into a particular neighborhood and find out what the smoke concentration forecast is going to be. It's that high resolution. And there are academic institutions as well as other organizations that are doing research on this for sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then do you have any biggest lessons that you've learned, maybe anything really surprising that's popped out to you from the recent Los Angeles wildfires that you want to take away from all of this?
Yeah, I mean, we should not, I think that's the operative word, Alex. We should not be surprised by wintertime wildfires in the western wintertime wildfires or something like that. But we shouldn't be surprised by them. But the intensity, I think, has caught everyone off guard. But going back and looking at it from a hindsight perspective, it makes sense. And I think this is the lesson learned, is that this can happen again. And it can happen with much more frequency, but it's hard to say how climate change is actually going to evolve this particular type of situation. La Ninas will continue. They are expected to, when they happen, perhaps occur with greater intensity, and that might mean a stronger ridge in Canada, and that might mean translate to even stronger winds in California. But the lesson learned here, Alex, is that these things can happen in the wintertime, and we have to be prepared for them to be very intense. And that also means not just from increasing the resiliency, but increasing the response measures. This is the off season for firefighters in that area. A lot of people that were on reserve that helped fight fires during the prime season
Mm.
were not on call. And that also contributed to what has turned out to be an incredible problem.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of pictures and videos of firefighters doing great work out there.
I mean, it remains to be seen what the fallout literally is going to be from this event. One thing I didn't mention is that the pattern is really not expected to break down for at least a few more weeks.
Oh, really?
It will diminish on certain days, but then it looks like it will build back up. And looking at some of the medium range models that go out to 3 and 4 weeks, it doesn't look like the pattern is going to break down anytime soon. That might change, but I've been looking at it for 2 weeks and it keeps showing the same thing for the end of the month. Unfortunately, we have not seen the end of this event.
Mhm.
And I will say that if the listeners want to read the blog and prompted to ask other questions, they can reach out to me or other members of the Society of Actuaries.
Sure. And what has to happen for that pattern to end in a couple of weeks? How does that come to a close?
Interestingly enough, something really, I mentioned one other aspect about a strong ridge is that it basically acts like a roller coaster track. So storms that are trying to come in from the Pacific Ocean are redirected upward into Canada, and they never make it in. So something really big and really strong has to come to literally bust through that roller coaster track, bring some wetness to the region. That alone will help reduce the issues. So adding some much needed moisture, but it will also start to break down the ridge. And that's important for the ultimate pattern to break down.
Perfect. The other thing you mentioned that I was just curious to ask about was like the human health aspect of everything. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about that?
Well, I mean, there are other aspects as well. I mean, we haven't talked about PTSD and what this is doing to people, post traumatic stress disorder. It's going to take a toll on the mental health of people. There are people that have lost everything. Homes are not insured. They literally will have nothing. And that is a very stressful situation. People that need to get help for other physical ailments besides respiratory illnesses are going to have trouble or could have trouble getting to those areas. Roads are down, they're basically burnt, they are non-existent. The facilities themselves may be at reduced capacity. So that aspect, I think, of this event is important to consider, and building resilience to improve that situation in the future has to be of utmost concern as well.
Okay, great. Is there anything else you want to share with everyone?
No, I think I've pretty much covered it, but again, I'll invite the listeners to read the blog. They may be prompted to ask other questions, and they can send them to me in posts or messages. I'll look forward to hearing from them.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks, Alex.